Now I should probably start this out with a disclaimer. If you've watched my other videos, you may have noticed I have more than a passing fancy for old survival horror games. This gives me more than a little bias on the subject. Keeping that in mind, what's about to follow are my opinions and should be treated as such. With the launch of Capcom's new entry into the Resident Evil universe looming overhead, I felt this was a perfect time to address the mammoth changes made to the series since the last true-to-form Resident Evil game. I also wanted to explain how some of the series' most unpopular features add to Resident Evil's trademark ability to immerse gamers in its world. This is Avalanche Reviews' top 4 features that need to return to
Resident Evil.
Here's a simple fact. A well-made CG cutscene will always have more graphical fidelity than in-game graphics. This is something game developers had figured out a long time ago. Developers of games like Resident Evil, Final Fantasy VII, and Chrono Cross knew that they'd be able to create a much more detailed backdrop by having an artist render it in CG and making it a navigable 2D image, and creating, placing, texturing, and rendering every object in a full 3D environment. Pre-rendered backgrounds always have a much fuller and detailed look to them than their 3D counterparts. They also give a very cool side effect. 3D character models set against a pre-rendered CG background look very sharp, crisp, and vibrant. I feel very strongly that these backgrounds added immensely to the feel of the original Resident Evil games. Imagine walking into the police precinct in RE2 and being able to look at its cluttered desk and dead bodies at any angle, or being able to closely examine all aspects of the environment. While this sounds great, this would take away much of the claustrophobic feeling of being stuck in Raccoon City's narrow alleys and the RPD's derelict hallways and rooms. Much of the horror of these games is derived from the inability to see what's coming at you. You have no idea what's waiting around the next corner, an effect that's lost on modern horror games. But I can already hear your fingers rapidly typing away. But Jared, those environments were a product of the graphical limitations of the time. They have no place in modern consoles with their amazing graphical potential. I don't think so. Remember this, little Jim? This is the remake of the first Resident Evil on the Nintendo GameCube, and in my opinion, the best looking game released in that console cycle. This remake, as it were, upped the ante by turning the series staple of pre-rendered backgrounds into pre-rendered CG movies that allowed realistic movement and lighting effects on the background. Every screen was a dynamically created masterpiece, my favorite part being the light and shadows cast on the wall every time lightning flashed outside. The Spencer Mansion had been brought to life in a brand new way, and the world was shown that this graphical style could indeed satisfy both the mainstream gamer's need for graphical prowess and the niche player's demand for a familiar look. Don't believe me? Take a look at Resonance of Fate, a very cool title from Sega and Tri-Ace for the PlayStation 3. That's right, pre-rendered CG moving backgrounds. Resident Evil's backgrounds kept both its hideous monsters and its technical limitations hidden from the player, and achieved a level of detail and polish that wouldn't have been possible on the consoles of the day. This, coupled with its successful use in both modern and classic graphical masterpieces, makes a strong argument for its inclusion in future Resident Evil titles. When someone asks you what you remember most about a specific Resident Evil game, chances are you won't bring up Ada's square boobs or god-awful spoken dialogue in the first game. Odds are the first thing you'll remember is being scared while playing the game. But why? Resident Evil games weren't good looking enough to make the player mistake it for reality, and consoles they were released on weren't able to play online and interact with real people. So why is it every time we read these words, we get that terrified feeling of dread? The answer? It's the little things. A collection of small mechanics within a game that, when done right, come together to create the most important part of a horror game: immersion. For my first example, I want you to take a look at this and tell me, other than a pretty serious jump in graphics, what's the difference here? Do you have it? That's right, the original Resident Evil games were devoid of any heads-up display. In a strange upset, the first game in the series was actually more realistic than its modern counterpart. In the early games, to check how much ammo you had left in your clip, you would have to physically look at your gun in your inventory. The same goes for your health. In modern Resident Evil games, the gap between player and character has never been bigger. You just try to get into Resident Evil's world with this staring at you in the face the entire time. And if that didn't destroy immersion enough, just wait. If there's one thing that ruins a game's dark and scary atmosphere, it's large, colorful button cues. Music is also a big part of what makes RE1 through Code Veronica great. Each area has a dark and eerie score to accompany it, and really fits your surroundings. There was just something about that dark ambience that kept you on edge. The dreary melodies really drove home the feeling that many people died here, and more are about to. The modern Resident Evil games are more action-oriented, and because of this, the scores are too. This makes for some pretty forgettable tracks, and really takes away from that fear that Capcom wants you to feel as you play. Ammunition is another sore spot for me, specifically the abundance of it. Let's face it, there's nothing scary about facing down a village full of enemies when you're armed to the teeth, and every tribesman in Africa is carrying handgun ammo. Resident Evil games used to make you decide what's more important to you, ammo or health. You could save ammo by running away from a zombie, but there's no guarantee that you're going to make it out of that exchange unscathed. This built an extreme amount of tension and brought a little tactical thinking to what could have been a fast-paced shooter. These aren't the only elements that added to Resident Evil's immersion, but they were in my opinion the most important. When scaring the player is the goal, these elements cannot be skipped on. At any given moment, you were scared by the dark, gloomy music or the fact that you may run out of ammo, and there was nothing in the game's presentation to remind you that you were playing a game. This allowed you to put yourself in the character's shoes, and as far as I'm concerned, if it's not immersive, it's not Resident Evil. Recent Resident Evil games have been very hard to get into. One reason for this is a lack of an easily identifiable villain. The Umbrella Corporation was a huge faceless conglomerate that literally oozed corruption, holding sway over entire US cities and influencing presidential decisions. Umbrella played an extremely important role in early games in the series. They gave the players something to hate. Sure, we were fighting tooth and nail to survive a deadly virus outbreak, but we needed a reason to get out of that mansion. We needed a stronger motivation than just living another day. When discovering Umbrella's illegal test on viral compounds and willingness to kill anyone to achieve their goal of covering up their mistakes, I was dead set on leading the remaining STARS members out of that mansion and straight to the newspapers. But the destruction of the Spencer Mansion and any evidence linking Umbrella to it went up in smoke. Resident Evil 2 and 3 were also chock full of reasons why Umbrella is the perfect villain. No matter how much you had on them, they always had a contingency plan. Umbrella was always able to slip away unnoticed, and let's face it, a private company with military contracts conducting experiments with bioorganic weapons isn't exactly far-fetched. Umbrella is something we can all actually imagine existing in the real world. As crazy as this is going to sound, the Umbrella Corporation grounded Resident Evil's story. I know there are a lot of complaints about Resident Evil's story being convoluted, but even this seems commonplace in a corrupt business. Backstab after backstab and corporate espionage are realities for top money-making companies in any country. You can only take the idea of a zombie outbreak so far. Shinji Mikami saw this when creating the series. He based the idea for the games on George Romero's zombie movies at the time. But Mikami filled in the gaps by letting the player know who was responsible and why. I think this made for a fuller and more realized world to set the games in. The obvious fantasy of the dead feasting on the living was made less fantastical when set against the backdrop of government cover-ups and experiments gone wrong. Newer games in the series lack this focus. Sure, there's always a bad guy, but they're always individuals or small groups with ridiculous plans of world domination. The creation of the T-Virus gave Umbrella a realistic goal. They wanted to create a bioorganic super soldier and sell them to the highest bidder. This is a believable tactic that justifies the amount of money and effort Umbrella puts into covering up their actions. The zombies being, of course, a side effect and completely unplanned. But in Resident Evil 4 and 5, enemies only seem to be interested in infecting everyone. This is a paper-thin motivation and really takes away from how serious you can take their stories. Umbrella really filled out early Resident Evil stories, and even though they caused so many deaths, I can't help but find myself hoping they come back. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I'm a huge zombie movie fan. And it's Resident Evil that started my obsession with the living dead. There's something about zombies that just scares the shit out of people, and Resident Evil added on that feeling. Instead of just watching a person try to survive a zombie apocalypse, you were controlling someone who was. And that jump from passively observing to actively interacting really upped the ante. This allowed Resident Evil to scare you in ways movies never really could. When you put yourself in the character's shoes, it made you scared of dying. In any other games, dying is an inconvenience at best and a frustration at worst, but Resident Evil made it terrifying. Love him or hate him, zombies are what Resident Evil is all about. Now let me clarify, this is a zombie. This is not. To explain why, let's go into why zombies scare us so much. Ever since the advent of the motion picture, monster movies have been trying their hardest to scare their audiences in new ways. The premise, however, seems to have remained untouched. A person or group of people that are easily identifiable are put in a situation where they must kill a terrible monster, or at the very least survive its wrath. And this obviously worked, but it can only be taken so far. Because no matter how much we fear the hideous beast, we can never identify with it. Zombies solved this problem. No longer were you killing inhuman mutations, you were face to face with plain old ordinary people. Zombies are just humans, but devoid of any humanity. Their lack of emotion or their inability to respond to pain or injury does something to us, and we love it. Now, why aren't the enemies in Resident Evil 4 and 5 scary like this? I mean, they act like zombies. Well, notice here, these guys are screaming and showing anger. This takes away from what we've already established as scary in Resident Evil games. These are just really pissed off people. I see this all the time, and it does nothing for me. Sure, they're more intelligent now and can climb and run and hold weapons, but all of this is the exact opposite of what terrifies us. They can now talk and take orders. These are human actions and can never really get under your skin the same way a zombie can. No pun intended. Just to clarify, I do understand that the Plagas hosts aren't supposed to be zombies. I just for the life of me can't understand the reasoning behind their exclusion from Resident Evil 4 and 5. What if Call of Duty suddenly turned into a stealth action game? The internet will be bursting at the seams with hate-filled fanboys ranting and raving. In all honesty, I feel like this change in the series was made to accommodate modern action game fans, who wouldn't be able to sit through 11 seconds of a Resident Evil game because of its lack of cover-based shooting or bare breasts. From what I understand, Resident Evil 6 will have its gameplay split between Leon facing down more traditional zombies and Chris dealing with the new Plagas-like monsters. This is more of an insult than a blessing. Why the hell would I play through a shitty third-person action game just so I can spend 1/3 of it playing a Resident Evil game? Why the fuck couldn't Capcom have made Leon's more traditional survival horror gameplay its own game? We don't want table scraps, Capcom. Don't give us Gears of War with moody lighting. Give us a truly scary experience. Give us Resident Evil back. Thanks for watching, guys. I know these aren't the most popular opinions, but try to keep in mind that they're just that. Whether you're for or against my views, I'd really like to hear what you guys have to say, so make sure to leave a comment. Hey, if you like this one, check out my other videos right here, and make sure to hit that subscribe button, or else something bad might happen to you. Or it might not, who knows.